Welcome to Fossils and Fiction, the podcast where we explore the culture and science of paleontology. I'm media researcher and dino geek Travis Holland.
And I'm paleontologist and weird bug enthusiast Alyssa Fjeld. Each episode, we uncover the incredible stories behind fossils and meet the people who study them, create art inspired by them, and bring prehistory to life.
Welcome to Fossils and Fiction. Thank you so much to everyone engaging with us over the last fortnight. We're going to discuss names for our mascots later on. There have been a huge number of suggestions. We've also got Paleo Pulse coming up pretty shortly, which is our news topic for the week, and a special guest interview. But first, I'm going to say hi to my new co-host. She's still settling into the chair. Alyssa, hi.
Hi, Travis. How are you doing today?
Yeah, pretty well. It's a nice hot day to be surviving this heat wave we're having up and down the East Coast. So,
Tell you, it's 40 degrees here in Melbourne today, and I'm not sure the wildlife knows what to do.
no, the animals definitely struggle. I saw some good advice that if you're hot, if you are struggling in the heat, it's a good idea to put some water out for birds and lizards and various other wildlife around the place and try and make sure they're looked after. And we love wildlife on this podcast, even though we mostly talk about the dead ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually put a little container of water, so you can just fill a little Tupperware with water and set it outside your house. Mine is currently being visited by a noisy miner.
Noisy miner, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want to support those ones, but I suppose
I
you can't really be picky which birds come along to the water.
Yeah.
Also wouldn't wish harm on them directly as such, but
just make less of yourselves.
yeah, exactly right. Let's start the episode proper with what I've now labelled Paleo Pulse. I think I've just sprung that on you now, but this is where we will discuss a recent paleo story. This one is by Barker et al. Out of the UK, and it looks at theropod diversity in the Lower English Wealden group. Darren Naish is one of the co-authors as well. He's quite well known around the place, and particularly for research into this area.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting things to me about this paper, and I just wanted to shout out to some people in my lab, Astrid O'Connor and Jake Katetsky, who I talked about this article with in order to get a slightly better understanding of what's kind of going on there. Theropods are not my wheelhouse, but they are very much Jake's wheelhouse, and Astrid is just a sweetheart. But there are two things that really stuck out to me as being interesting with this article. And the first is that these are fossils from the Cretaceous that are coming out of a location in the UK that does have dinosaur-bearing strata, but it has something in common with our dinosaur strata here in Australia. And that is the relative incompleteness of the animals that they get out of there and the inventiveness that they have to exhibit in order to actually understand what they've gotten. So here in Australia, if you didn't know, there are dinosaurs, and there are especially ones here in Victoria in the coast of Inverloch. And when we dig these dinosaurs up, they're coming out of this deposit that really banged them up in the process of getting them deposited in the mud. So this really powerful river current was breaking these bones apart into little fragments, and that tends to be all we find here. So we have to get pretty creative in the ways that we analyze those bones. What we're seeing is that these are not full dinosaur skeletons either. Rather, these are teeth. They're just teeth. So the authors of this paper have had to come up with a really inventive way of using generative AI in order to explore what the different assemblages were represented by. And the other thing that I thought was really cool about this that ties into today's guest star is that this is material showing something very peculiar going on. And it's something that we see in the Hell Creek Formation as well, but with a different group of animals. So in the Isle of Wight, what they're seeing is that there are an awful lot of medium-sized predators, as well as one Spinosaurus, so a very large apex predators in this environment. But there are lots and lots of these I don't want to say mid-tier, that implies, I think, that they're shittier.
Well, we're going to ask about you fighting them later, so ranking in terms of tiers might be great.
That's fair. So you've got like all of these animals that would be like, I guess, comparable to having like a bunch of bobcats and coyotes and all of these medium-sized predators in an environment. And you start to have to ask yourself, how is this environment supporting all of these different groups that have these high metabolic costs? And our guest, Colin, is going to talk a little bit about a similar phenomenon that happens in the Hell Creek Formation. This is a U.S. deposit with super complete allosaurs and different sauropods. And what they see in the Hell Creek Formation, as Colin will talk about in a bit, is that you have an environment that is supporting a huge diversity of large-bodied sauropods. And the question you have to ask in that circumstance is, how? How are all of these delicious little grass creatures feeding, well, not grass, it wouldn't have been grass yet, leafy boys, let's say, how are they being supported in their environment? And Colin has a lot to say that this is due primarily to where their necks are allowing them to feed in the canopy, which I didn't know. That's really cool.
Mm. So niche partitioning is really important, and as you were alluding to, in this case, they're looking at theropods, so primarily the meat eaters. And I think that the thinking was previously that the sort of received wisdom was that probably there was Spinosaurids and Oviraptorosaurian possibilities in that location. But now you have to also consider, when finding teeth or finding skeletal remains, that there are Tyrannoraptor, Tyrannosaurid, Dromaeosaurid as well. So essentially, a lot more meat eaters at this time and place than we might have understood previously. And as you say, how is the environment supporting that? If you imagine herds of tens of thousands of Triceratops, for example, as you were talking about in Hell Creek, roaming across the landscape, or sauropods, how are they supported by the environment? Because you certainly couldn't imagine that in the modern day landscape.
Like, it's so interesting because the more we learn about these animals as animals, the more they become almost familiar to us. And then you get these monkey wrenches that throw all of that into not contention, but it illustrates, I think, that as much as we learn about the past, it really was a very different place and had very different ecosystems.
Mm. And so it points to some of those interesting questions. What were the ecosystems actually like? What were the animals, their food web relationships like, or their trophic relationships like? Absolutely interesting. I think it's probably then time to get on to the guest. So you've already mentioned his name. I learned so much from this interview. I did the interview editing. The guest goes into so much information about details of allosauroids, and I was thinking, great, this is really interesting and fun. And then suddenly we get that switch to the sauropod you were talking about. And so he talks about scanning and apatosaurine during the research, and the niche partitioning of all these sauropods as well. So introduce the guest for us a little bit, and then we'll jump into the interview.
Absolutely. Colin Boisvert is a vertebrate paleontologist who's currently studying out of the University of Oklahoma after doing his master's degree at the University of Utah, I believe. He is an absolutely fascinating researcher who's looking at a mix of both allosaurs, which are the big meat-eating boys that you know and love, as well as apatosaurs. And some of that work was also co-produced by Melbourne's own Jack Perkins, who is working at Melbourne Museum at the moment. The really interesting things that Colin has to say about dinosaurs are rivaled only by the really cool revelations that he has about finding your way as an early career researcher. I think, while we're springing acronyms, I think he really has the 3 Ps that drive a lot of early people in paleo, right? He's got the passion. It's super obvious talking to him that this is a man that could talk about dinosaurs day and night. And those are exactly the kinds of people that you want in paleo, because it often is that you might have curveballs thrown at you, or you might lose funding, and you really need that passion driving you to continue to reach for opportunities and do what you're doing. And he also has that persistence that you need to do that as well. Some people say that having a PhD or getting a PhD is really more a test of stubbornness, and I think that's absolutely a case you can make. Colin really channels that beautifully into his research. I think he does a great job of explaining it himself. And he also has the third good quality, which is pure luck. Sometimes great opportunities will come your way, and if you do what Colin does and seize those opportunities with that passion and persistence, you'll make the most of the opportunity you've been given. And I think Colin just does an excellent job of demonstrating all of those qualities really well.
Fantastic, Alyssa. Well, thank you so much for going out and doing that interview. We'll jump to it now.
It's my second episode here, and we are talking with the fantastic dinosaur man, Colin Boisvert, who completed his undergraduate degree, I believe, in California, and then his master's degree at BYU in Utah, and is now studying allosaurs at, was it Oklahoma Uni?
Oklahoma State University, Center for Health Sciences is the full title.
How's life been? How's Oklahoma?
Oklahoma's all right. It's interesting. I think it's finally starting to get colder, so we'll see how the winter compares to Utah. And life's okay, just, chugging along in clinical anatomy. and learning about the human body.
Well, that certainly sounds exciting and probably quite interesting as a comparison to what you're doing with dinosaur anatomy. Jack Perkins was telling me a little bit about your project, and he said that you're currently working with allosaurs. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So I am working with Allosaur. I don't know how much I can say, but I mean, I'm an open book. Basically, Allosauridae, as of this moment, if you went out into Google Scholar, into the literature, you would see a surprising situation. We've had different species of Allosaurus described as of 2020, and I have a funny story involving that one, Allosaurus jamatsoni. Of course, Allosaurus fragilis, which had its neotype finally designated in, I believe it was December of last year, 2023. And then, of course, Allosaurus europus, described in 2006 from Portugal. And then, of course, the ever classic, ever interesting Saurophagonax maximus is the last member of the clade Allosauridae, a clade that currently only exists during the late Jurassic period of Europe and North America. But, like I said, as of today, if you went onto Google Scholar, and it could change in the future, hopefully will. What's really interesting is Allosaurus jamatsoni, currently Allosaurus europus, and then, specifically those two, haven't been phylogenetically placed into the family Allosauridae. We often see Allosaurus treated as a OTU, operational taxonomic unit, where it's just the genus Allosaurus, and then of course they compare it usually, such as in Carano et al. 2012, to Saurophagonax and show a sister relationship between those two. But what is the exact relationship between Fragilis, Jamatsoni, Europus, and Saurophagonax maximus? In a small way, that's what part of my thesis hopes to work on a little bit, but I'm just getting started. So we're just starting to figure it out. Or
that sounds
start to work on it. I cannot say figure it out, but start to work on it.
That sounds really exciting. Now, for the people out there who may not remember the Allosaurus from their Jurassic Park franchise or other children's media, Allosaurids are a group of theropod dinosaurs that are carnivorous, and that's kind of the extent of my knowledge about them, beyond that one of them was originally discovered by one of our Bone Wars champions, Mr. Marsh, if I remember correctly. Can you tell us a little bit more about what an Allosaurus is, and Marsh as well, if you'd like?
Yeah. Marsh did describe, I should know this, I'm getting better. Marsh did describe originally Allosaurus. However, the story, and Cope is involved too, because Cope found bones that would end up getting synonymized with Allosaurus, but initially were described as a different taxon. Now, Allosaurus has a difficult taxonomic history because, funny enough, we actually have to go past both of them to Joseph Leddy, who found bones we think attributed to Allosaurus, or that we have been attributed to Allosaurus, but he thought they were from a new species of Pocleopleuron, which is a megalosaur, relative of, in this case, Megalosaurus, the first described dinosaur. But they later were like, no, I don't think this is Pocleopleuron. This is its own genus. So then it was redescribed as Antrodemus. And then you have Antrodemus valens. And then later we have Allosaurus fragilis, among others. But then work in the 90s by Charles Gilmore would show it looks like Antrodemus and Allosaurus are just the same thing. And so it gets a little complicated there. And then there's the fact that Chury discusses Allosaurus jamatsoni in his thesis that's out there. But then the description would come in 2020. And then Allosaurus europus, first initially discussed in papers in 1999. The paper is out in 2006. But really, so the difficulty, once again, is with Allosaurus fragilis, because with Allosaurus fragilis, there's the holotype, but the holotype is from some scrappy material that is, or scrappier material that's in the Yale Peabody collections. And so therefore there was difficulty with, well, can we keep this holotype? And so that's why there was a petition to describe, in this case, a neotype, or to designate a neotype. And so in this case, USNMV 4734, which is at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, or the National Museum of Natural History, is now the designated neotype for Allosaurus fragilis. And then, of course, there are still, I think there were claims in the 1900s made that Antrodemus was valens. And along with Antrodemus, you have Allosaurus atrox, Labrosaurus, Creosaurus. These are all animals that have been later synonymized with Allosaurus, and I think specifically Allosaurus fragilis, but they were around. Pentarius, that was the one Koch named. And then, of course, you have even more recently Allosaurus lucasi, described in 2014, which is part of, once again, the Yale Peabody collections. We really have a question. What is Allosaurus fragilis? What is Allosaurus jamatsoni? And of course, we know Allosaurus europus and Saurophagonax, but what are they? How can we kind of constrict them, and where are they all related? As to the other part of your question, Allosaurus is what we call a tetanurine, which means stiff tail, as my memory serves correctly. Basically, it's a more derived clade of theropods, so we're not including, in this case, Ceratosaurus and Abelisaurs, but we are including Megalosaurs, and then Allosaurs, and then we have all of Coelurosauria, which is basically, if it's not a Ceratosaur, it's not an early theropod, it's not a coelophysoid, it's not an Allosaur or a Megalosaur, then it's probably a Coelurosaur, right? These include Tyrannosaurs, Megaraptorans, which I do believe are separate, but once again, phylogenetics, we got to let it take its course. Ornithomimids, Deinonychosaurs, birds, Therizinosaurs, right? A whole swath of different theropods. But so we have Allosaurus. Allosaurus itself is distinguishable. They have some beautiful, beautiful bony crests on their lacrimal bones. They're just gorgeous to behold and gorgeous to hold. I've held a couple Allosaurus lacrimals in my hand. Otherwise, Allosaurus, in this case, had 3 functional fingers, big claws. It, we think, could potentially run, it's not a lightning fast runner. We're not talking a cheetah. This is an animal that probably more would have ambushed its prey. It could keep a pace for maybe a short distance. Otherwise, long tail, S-shaped neck, decently powerful jaws, and based on research, potentially a very powerful neck. But, as of course, biomechanical models are always being updated. Sharp teeth, right? These teeth were designed for slicing flesh versus T-Rexes, which are designed to just crush you, bone and all. Yeah, so claws, jaws, and a terrifying body. And then there are claims. We can't necessarily state this yes or no. Maybe Allosaurus was gregarious, whether that's probably in this case more an opportunistic gang sort of situation versus a traditional mammalian, pack or family unit. But
I saw some literature indicating as well that they can unhinge their jaws quite wide. Do you support that hypothesis?
I don't think I've looked into enough of the biomechanical models regarding that research in order to give a solid yay or nay. Now, from what I've heard, Allosaurus does have an extra joint in its lower jaw, and so I believe from what I've learned that lower joint would help with expanding the mouth. So I think it is possible. I don't know if it could fully unhinge, but it could definitely go for, I think, a wide gape and potentially start to expand the jaw.
Be very useful if I wanted to consume a whole ornithopod or other delicious creature from the time. So you said there were a couple of new things in the world of Allosaur research. You talked about a 2020 paper that you have a fun story about. Can you tell us what's new and maybe your funny story?
Yeah, of course. So 2020, we didn't know it. I didn't know it, along with a big year in general with a lot of interesting events. 2020 would also be the year that I'm walking into my microbiology class at University of California, Davis. It's a Friday morning. I'm tired. I got class all day, and I'm like, all right, let's just get through this. Or actually, it wasn't microbiology, it was cell biology. It's like, all right, let's get through this cell biology class because I struggled with cell biology. I had to really, really work at it, and it was a difficult class for me. And of course, you try to keep your ears to the ground, and you got Discord and you got Facebook, your other social media popping up with news articles about new carnivore discovered that, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, I think it was the classic, right? New carnivore discovered relating to T-Rex. According to popular media, sometimes every new theropod is a relative of T-Rex, which isn't entirely inaccurate. It's just, it's like, well, there are some things that are actually closer to T-Rex that are other tyrannosaurs. And then there's, hey, this is an Allosaur. How about you say new theropod related to Allosaurus? Or, let's bring in Jurassic World, new theropod related to Giganotosaurus, right? So, but it's always, because you see these articles all the time. They discover and describe a new Abelisaur, something that is very distantly related to T-Rex. And they're like, new theropod from Africa related to T-Rex discovered. And there's been a few times where I've seen that and gone like, wait, did they find a Tyrannosaur in Africa finally? And then it's like, oh, no, it's an Allosaur. I need to stop falling for this. So I had my doubts when I see this article, and there was a piece of paleo art with it. But I clicked the article, and I think I remember swearing because I was like, holy, because I read it and it's saying, yeah, University of Utah just announced, or they're about to announce today prior to their Dino Fest, an annual event they have at the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City. They're about to drop, they described a new species of Allosaurus. And I click the link and follow it to PeerJ and start trying to look through the article. But I was just ecstatic the rest of the morning. I forget what my lecture was about. I just kept thinking, yo, we got a new species of Allosaurus from North America. This is amazing. And especially in this case, a very famous specimen, MOR 693, otherwise known to the public at times as Big Al, which was the star of the documentary Allosaurus, a Walking with Dinosaurs special, or the Ballad of Big Al, is actually a member of this new species. It's considered a referred specimen to Allosaurus jamatsoni. So that was just really cool to think that it's like, whoa, there's a new Allosaurus on the scene, and it's already got it has its holotype from Dinosaur National Monument, and it also had, I'd say, a spokes member with Big Al. So that was really cool. Even more recently, we had Meraxes gigas, a Carcharodontosaur. It's always exciting when we get a new Carcharodontosaur, and especially with Meraxes, it's very interesting because of the whole forelimb. They see forelimb shortening happening similar to Tyrannosaurs, and so it's a question of why is this happening? And it seems now maybe this is a general trend across multiple bodies of large-bodied theropod dinosaurs that this is occurring, especially because just very recently we have new referred material to Taurovenator, which was considered earlier on a dubious Carcharodontosaur genera, especially because it was based on the holotype was a post-orbital. But now we have extra material. It does look like it's different, and it also shows this forelimb shortening. So it's like, okay, seems to be a common trend. This is very curious. What's going on here? And along with that, we also have a Metriacanthosaur that was just described earlier this year in, I believe it was in August. It's from Kyrgyzstan, and that's really exciting because based on when it's found and where it's found, it would be amazing in my book if we could get a biogeographical study on this animal, because there seems to be this trend, and maybe it's just me, there seems to be this trend popping up where we're seeing that with regard to the Allosauroid story, you have Asphaltovenator from South America, which is kind of the, okay, wait, how did that get there? I'm confused. But otherwise, the rest of the earliest Allosauroids and the earliest Metriacanthosaurs are all in Asia. It kind of seems like they're spinning a loop in Asia, and they just keep pumping out new genera, and that's where they start. And then we see eventually a strand, I'm going to call it, I don't know, that's technically not true, a branch. A branch eventually leaves and gets to, we have Metriacanthosaurus in Europe around 160 million years ago. And now, between that species 160 million years ago, a few other Metriacanthosaurs, such as, in this case, Synraptor, Yangchuanosaurus, which are around the same age, and a few maybe older ones and older Allosauroids, we now have, I would say, about the same time, and also in the middle, you have our new genera from Kyrgyzstan. So kind of seems like we can say, all right, there was definitely a migration from Asia to Europe. And then, of course, once we get to Europe with Allosauridae, that's a nexus point. The late Jurassic was a very interesting time, it seems, for Allosauroids, because we have, in this case, currently the last of the Metriacanthosaurs. We also get potentially one of the earliest, if not the earliest, Carcharodontosaurs with Lusovenator in Portugal, as well as we have our Portugal Allosaurus species, Allosaurus europus. And then, obviously, from there, we will also then later have, or potentially at the same time, have Allosaurus in North America. So were they diversifying in Europe and then spreading out, or is it maybe the opposite?
Very, very interesting, especially thinking about, I suppose, what we get here in Australia, where there's very little, I assume, and Jake Katevsky can come for me if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that the theropods we get here exhibit very little forelimb shortening. So their arms are not retreating as we think about the typical T-Rex arms. And it's interesting as well that these animals are doing this diversification in the Jurassic. I think it's pretty common knowledge now that most of the dinosaurs that we feature in Jurassic Park are not actually from the Jurassic. So you could, in theory, then have your Allosaur as your major predator, and that would be pretty exciting.
Yes, and equally terrifying in terms of the media. Before T-Rex took a major step on the scene, a lot of times, I think even in literary work, Allosaurus was used once it was discovered as the big terrifying dinosaurian predator. Right, it was, top of the heap. It has a major starring role in The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, with one of my favorite adaptations being the 2001 A&E movie. And so, yeah, so Allosaurus is a terrifying predator. It also got a spotlight, which was amazing, in Battle at Big Rock with the Jurassic series.
So, just to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned that this was something, these new discoveries were starting to come out even when you were in your undergraduate degree at UC Davis. And I think that's a pretty typical story for a lot of us in paleo. This is something that is an interest that has followed us for a significant portion of our lives. It sounds like that's something that would be true for you, a long, lifelong interest in dinosaurs, specifically Allosaurs, or has it changed?
No, it hasn't really changed. I think it became defined. So I've loved dinosaurs since I was a little kid, and I grew up in one of the most, I want to say, interesting places to love paleontology, which is I grew up in Silicon Valley, aka the tech capital of the world. So everyone's looking to the future, and Colin's looking to the past. The kind of biggest and most natural history-esque like museum that I grew up with was the California Academy of Sciences, which is an amazing museum, but they even pride themselves on, when it comes to natural history, they're not a standard natural history museum like we see, in the movies and we visit in places such as Utah, New York, and such. They focus more on the natural, and then the history is kind of part of the background in terms of them describing processes such as evolution and how that works and adaptive radiation. Sure, you're greeted in the front of the Cal Academy, the new building as of 2008, by a T-Rex. But besides that T-Rex and a few other mentions of fossils, it's a lot more learning about, biodiversity in the oceans, right? They have a huge exhibit on coastal environments, especially because California is a coastal state. And our our kelp forests are very important. They have a rainforest dome. They have a hall on Africa, which does have a little bit on hominid evolution. But so I grew up Silicon Valley, right, in a very different place, but I've loved dinosaurs since I was a kid. I was always trying to talk to everyone I knew about dinosaurs. It oftentimes became a lecture, so it was very difficult. It was in high school as I was starting to figure out, where did I want to apply to college. My dad and I did a trip to the University of Wyoming, and it was there that I really got my first glimpse talking to them regarding, how undergraduate and future work with paleontology works, that I learned, they said, well, when people tend to specialize, right, you can say, oh, I want to study dinosaurs, but then people usually study a specific type of dinosaur or use a specific group of dinosaurs as a case study with specific methods. So that's where I really started to think, well, what did I want to study? Since I was a little kid, I had loved, and it still is my favorite dinosaur, Giganotosaurus, and that is probably mainly because of Nigel Marven and his Chased by Dinosaurs special, which I watched so many times as a kid. And technically it features Mapusaurus that we now know, but at the time they thought it was Giganotosaurus, and it's a beautiful special. It's 30 minutes, amazing. I've actually talked over COVID, funny enough, Nigel Marven, he basically put on his website, you can still do it. You could basically pay him to have a Zoom call with him. So I was like, yes, please. So I talked with that man and told him what I was studying and said, I loved everything you worked on in the early 2000s. I'm a huge fan. It was a great conversation. He's an amazing person, super nice. But so I realized I wanted to study allosauroids. And so I came to college, and college was really, it was a great experience, obviously, even in the end where things got crazy because of COVID. But college was eye-opening, where I learned, right? I can't believe I didn't see this coming. Shocker. Not the biggest fish in the pond when it comes to what you know about paleontology. I mean, obviously I had professors, and I knew I did not know more than my professors, but even among just the other undergraduates and, of course, the graduate students, right? I don't want to say I learned my place, but I kind of learned to, in my case, stop talking and just listen and see what I can learn from others. And I learned a lot. I think I became quieter, and I didn't necessarily voice my theories all the time. I tried to, I think, become more calculating in terms of, well, I think we can make this claim based on this evidence. And I think that's especially reflected towards the end of my time at UC Davis. Yes, I rushed it a little bit more, and I should have taken a longer period of time. But one of my favorite things was in an ecology class I was taking, I ended up writing on one of my favorite subjects from one of my favorite paleontologists, Scott Sampson, right? He wrote an amazing article in the Scientific American that came out in 2014 that basically just asked the question and discussed a situation regarding, all right, Laramidia, roughly, as I remember, half the size of Australia at anywhere from 4 to 7 million square, I think, miles in this case, but similar size to Australia, and a fifth of the size of Africa. Africa today features, I think they said, about a half dozen mega herbivores over 1 ton in weight. Laramidia, anywhere from 80 to, we'll say, 70 million years ago, and it's just for ballpark 75, has over 2 dozen. What is happening? Why is there an oversaturation of so many mega herbivorous dinosaurs in Campanian Laramidia, right? This shouldn't be possible. This shouldn't be able to fit the environment. And so that ecology class allowed me to really dive deep. And I kind of did a lit review term paper where I basically said, okay, here's the question. Can we use the current literature to try to explain this? It turns out we might be able to. And with regard to the histology of the prey versus the histology of the predators, aka our predators, especially tyrannosaurs, were getting to adult size, if they made it, at about the same time that our herbivores were getting into their older age, combined with surprising sources of food, from potential bark to crustaceans, that maybe our animals weren't necessarily just always eating the softest plants. They would go after other sources of food to supplement their diet. There seems to be kind of a, as we often expect in nature, a multi-factor mechanism for how we can explain why so many large-bodied mega herbivorous dinosaurs are surviving in Campanian Laramidia. Now, obviously, time is a factor. They weren't all living at exactly the same place in time, but we have multiple quarries where we know, all right, we have at least one ceratopsian, at least one chasmosaur, potentially one lambeosaurine and one saurolophine, as well as, an ankylosaur and a pachycephalosaur and potentially a few others. So we know there are environments where we have a lot of these animals. And then we have multiple of these that are at roughly the same age. So it was a great question. So that was, I think, really important for me. My professor said, yeah, your paper's kind of a little, arm wavy in terms of, I think, drawing attention. But hey, sometimes we need those studies to get people's attention, to say, hey, I know we're all slowly coming here. And there have been a ton of people doing amazing work with this that are showing that there's definite niche partitioning happening. And then we have, of course, the alternate diets. And then we could probably bring histology into it and other factors as well, such as maybe what we're seeing is these animals could have had lower population demographics. So there are, so many of these animals, but maybe they didn't have massive herds. Now, they definitely had to have some mass, because we know we have a Centrosaurus bone bed with over potentially 10,000 individuals in Canada, but maybe they all weren't like that. Maybe some were rarer than others in terms of population dynamics. So that was an important thing that I think helped me learn a bit more about the scientific method and learn to structure my ideas.
I have several thoughts about this. First, crabs, how exciting. My gosh, that is like detrophagy so the eating of crustaceans and other hard-shelled mollusks in dinosaurs would be thrilling for me as an arthropod person. We love to see a crushing plate. I'm not saying that they had crushing plates. Now I'm just imagining a sauropod with like a Port Jackson style mouth going, and I want that to be real. So
I think it was crabs. Otherwise, it might have been gastropods. All I know is it was invertebrates, and it was surprising that when I read it, I was like, I did not expect that, especially from these
next
herbivores.
thing you know, we'll be finding evidence for the garlic butter recipes in the Cretaceous and Jurassic as well. My next thought is, I think it's really interesting that you also grew up in an area that did not really have a lot of natural history in terms of the museums and other readily available public institutions. Tennessee does have some absolutely fantastic museums, and we also have
ETSU.
Yes, ETSU has a fantastic, I believe it's Cenozoic animal deposit known as the Gray Fossil Site, where you can find just a fantastic array of very well preserved mammals and other sorts of things. But the closest museum to me was a children's museum that had like a PVC pipe you could pump air through to simulate the sound of a Parasaurolophus honking. And I think there's that element of mystery that exists within the context you grow up in that can be very motivating. And I think as well, you had the other three key ingredients that I see time and time again with other paleos. You had the creativity, the drive to yap about it. I think the yapping tends to be, we're all into the yapping. And then you got the tempering. So the ability to figure out where and when your creativity and your capacity to convey that science becomes the most important, and when it's time to listen to others to help you resharpen those arguments. So I think that's really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about your journey after you graduated from UC Davis. So I know you did a master's degree. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Temperance, I've had to learn firsthand. An important story I didn't mention was when I was a middle schooler, some family and I actually went up north into Oregon and basically checked out John Day fossil beds. And along with that, visited Fossil Oregon, where behind their high school, you can dig for plant fossils. And that was really kind of a first experience for me with digging, and where I learned a lesson the hard way, because I took my rock hammer and just whacked in the hillside, both thinking, I'm going to find the dinosaur. They say you can't find dinosaurs here. I'll dig up deep enough to find it, as well as I probably broke a few plant fossils along the way. And I actually found, I think, a lot of the plant fossils I ended up taking with me in the refuse pile from other people. But I learned through that, when visiting a specimen where they showed how a hyper-enthused person who ended up finding and then I think donating a specimen, as I remember from the exhibit, to John Day fossil beds, in the process kind of damaged the specimen, and how patience was really important in this field. The other thing, funny enough, it's slightly gotten better. We also have a children's discovery museum in San Jose, and it actually now houses, I forget what year it was, I was in high school though, they found along the river that runs through our town the bones of a Columbian mammoth that died in the area, and now its fossils are in that museum. I was applying to grad school, and I decided to apply to more programs, and I'm glad I did. And I applied to a mixture of PhD and master's programs, and along with that, I was applying to internships. And what ended up happening is, I applied to 9 programs. I got into BYU, and I also got into an internship at the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota, before I then came home quickly, packed up my stuff, and moved out to Provo, Utah for my master's. So the internship was amazing. We went to so many cool places, checked out a lot of cool things. I was an education intern, so it literally was my job to yap to people about, here's why paleontology is important, here's what we're discovering at this site. It was a sinkhole. I even wrote a parody song about it. It's beautiful. And then I started my master's. And my master's, I had a chance. I could have described a specimen of Allosaurus that they had, a specimen there. But instead, I ended up working on, there's a specimen, BYU 18531. It is an apatosaurine that is from the Brushy Basin member of the Morrison Formation, which is a late Jurassic rock unit here in North America. This specimen was found down south near Moab, Utah, so right near Arches and Canyonlands National Park. This specimen was originally discovered by a local rock shop owner and named Lynn Ottinger and his son Sonny. And then they reported it to BYU, who got permission from BLM because it was on BLM land. And then BYU excavated the specimen between 2007 to 2009. And that's a funny thing, because people would always ask me sometimes when I gave presentations on this specimen, did you get to help dig it up? And I was like, no, I was in 5th grade, so I did not help dig it up. That would have been very interesting, though, as a 5th grader doing that. But this specimen was unique, and I'm actually going to be speaking about this on Wednesday for the Moab chapter of the Utah Friends of Paleontology on my thesis. The specimen is relatively complete with an almost complete neck. We had apatosaurines generally have 15 neck bones, 15 cervical vertebrae. They found C2 through C15. We were only missing the atlas, or C1. These bones were relatively complete with minimal distortion. So it provided a chance to ask the question, how did this animal hold its neck? So basically, I did a study looking into the what we call ONP, osteological neutral pose. So how might this animal potentially held its neck? That's what it was. It was focused on obviously neck biomechanics. We wanted to potentially try to get range of motion in there as well, but that did not happen in the time frame. So in the future, that'll have to be done. So it was still really interesting. This project involved, we had to do photogrammetry for cervical 2 through cervical 13. We ended up using, at the end of my first year, they purchased a Faro scanner, which is a 3D surface scanner. And that's how we would get models of dorsal 2 through dorsal 4, because this animal has almost all 10 of its dorsals. Now you're asking, Colin, you forgot C14 and C15 and dorsal 1. What are you doing? I didn't forget. Those bones were still attached by a matrix. They were left together, whereas every other bone, because once again, this was an articulated neck, was separated from each other. We took those 3 bones to an industrial CT scanner down in Southern California, NSI, North Star Imaging, where we put these bones into an industrial CT scanner in order to get CT scans of them and then use CT segmentation in order to figure out what do these bones look like? And, in this case, how far apart are they from each other in terms of intervertebral spacing? For reference, this industrial CT scanner, the average hospital CT scanner uses about 0.1 million electron volts. We bombarded this specimen with 6 million electron volts, and the scan took 30...
Gosh.
Yeah. But so that's how we got models, and then I did CT segmentation, or as I like to call it, the world's worst form of adult coloring, took almost 6 weeks. And then we had these models. Now, for a lot of these models, not all of them due to time constraints, we realized, wow, they're not really distorted, but there is still some distortion due to diagenetic alteration as well as human preparation. So for cervical 2 through cervical 13, we try to digitally restore the bones as much as possible around problematic areas, especially focused on the, in this case, condyle or the cup at the front, the cotyle, the cup on the back, or the cup on the back, the ball on the front, and then the pre and post hypophyses, basically faces where these bones are articulating with each other. So we try to take these digitally restored models in order to put them through an animation program known as Autodesk Maya, as well as we used scaled 3D prints from our engineering lab on campus to physically rig a dinosaur neck and therefore compare virtually and physically how did this animal potentially hold its neck. And what we found is, this animal was actually kind of holding its neck, not necessarily straight, not in the classic S shape. What we found is it had a transition point at dorsal 1, and then it basically was a sinusoidal drooping neck. So it went up and then down. But generally, it was down for at least this specific animal. Now, I'd like to preface from what I've seen in the literature and what I think I have come to the same conclusion based on the literature and seeing other dinosaur necks, especially other sauropod necks. I don't think it's necessarily a one-fits-all model when it comes to sauropod necks. This Momenchisaurus on my shirt probably has a different neck posture than I think it's Argentinosaurus or Diplodocus on the back of my shirt. Different clades probably had different neck postures and potentially even different intraclade neck postures. Who's to say that Diplodocus had the same neck posture as Apatosaurus? I mean, my thesis gets into a core issue, another large issue of what I like to call CMSI, the Koval-Morrison sauropod issue. It's not a murder crime scene, though we are technically studying dead bones. But how do so many large-bodied, long-necked animals, multiple times larger than an elephant, live in the same place at the same time? This is nowhere more prevalent than at Dry Mesa Dinosaur Quarry, which is a BYU locality where there is evidence of at least 6 different sauropod genera at this one single quarry. It has Patasaurus, Camarasaurus, Brachiosaurus, Supersaurus, Diplodocus, and Haplocanthosaurus, and then potentially Barosaurus. So at least 6 genera of sauropods in one locality. Okay, if we have 6 animals that are, in this case, even multiple times larger than our mega herbivorous Campanian dinosaurs, our ornithischians, and there are still ornithischians in the environment, there's got to be some kind of extreme niche partitioning or other multiple variables for how these animals are able to live at the same place at the same time. And neck posture is part of that, because neck posture gets into, well, based on how this animal is holding its neck and how far it can move its neck, that can tell us a little bit about the feeding envelope, which is work that has been done by scientists such as Ken Stevens. And then, from feeding envelope, you can get an idea of, okay, this one has this feeding envelope and this one has this feeding envelope. And so you can try to figure out, all right, how are all these different sauropods feeding? Of course, getting back to it, that kind of requires that you have a lot of nice necks, and we don't always have a lot of nice neck fossils for sauropods, so we have to use what we can to figure out what's possible.
That's fascinating. I can't imagine an environment with that many large herbivores in it. But so you're saying that it's essentially that the necks are allowing them to eat vegetation at different heights within the canopy. Would that be correct?
Yes, I would say so. These animals are likely feeding at different heights, and even there's evidence, right, that even if a Apatosaurus, let's say, wasn't feeding high in the trees, there's evidence, biomechanical models, to indicate it might have been able to rear up. And so if it is able to rear up, in this case, kind of like a kangaroo, maybe balancing on its tail a little bit, this animal then might have been able to reach high into the trees occasionally to get its tall greens. But for the most part, maybe it wasn't always doing that, especially if its neck posture, right, is further down. There have already been some claims made that, like, Camarasaurus was maybe kind of feeding in the middle, mid browsing height. Brachiosaurus was a high browser, and then claims that animals such as Diplodocus and Apatosaurus might have been feeding lower. So
it makes sense that you would have different neck posturing in this really diverse group. Like, I think this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily. I think it's something that if you said it to them, they would go, yes, that makes sense. But sauropods, theropods, the diversity of dinosaurs, even within these familiar groups, is tremendous. The number of different species we get and the different life habits, it's very fascinating.
In terms of the whole, actually, different sauropods had different neck postures. Well, you definitely get that if you read a lot of sauropod neck poses, but what I was finding with my thesis, especially at the end, is in terms of, okay, we had a hypothesis, we rejected that hypothesis, and we found a neck that was like this. So in terms of what was this animal likely eating on, well, I had to really go into the literature and expand, because you have to start using other pieces of evidence that are also independently pointing or providing evidence for a similar conclusion, right? So there's evidence that a close relative of Apatosaurus, Nigeriosaurus, has a really high tooth replacement rate. So dinosaurs, unlike mammals, are constantly replacing their teeth throughout their lifetime. And we're seeing in some diplodocoids, such as Nigeriosaurus, that they're really replacing their teeth, like, very rapidly. Like, we're talking, a tooth gets replaced, I think it was every 15 to 30 days, a tooth is replaced. And so one of the ideas is, well, why are they replacing their teeth so fast? Maybe it's because they're eating abrasive vegetation. What usually in this case is abrasive, a lot of ground growing vegetation. Now you have to remember, though, in the late Jurassic, we don't, as far as we know, have grasses, which are the general, abrasive vegetation we might think of today, especially with horses. So in this case, these animals are feeding on other ground-growing vegetation that's wearing down their teeth super quick. And that, using phylogenetics, this Patasaurian, BYU 18531, also might have had a quick replacement rate on its teeth. That, coupled with Apatosaurus's muzzle, or kind of its snout, is a little bit broader compared to some of its relatives. And Nigeriosaurus has a very broad snout. And in mammals, a broadening of the muzzle has been correlated with kind of being a grazer. Combine that with, cranial biomechanics, which indicate diplodocoids likely were able to rake food in because they had non-occluding dentition, and so that allowed more translational movement, but they had weaker bite forces compared to other animals, and that weaker bite force may have helped with eating, in this case, vegetation that's lower to the ground and likely softer versus hard, woody material. You kind of start to paint a picture that, all right, maybe all these things are adding up, that this animal was feeding on one specific area of its environment. And then the same thing for other sauropods. I mean, people, I think with Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, keep coming back to that conclusion that those types of dinosaurs seem to be feeding more in the mid to high browsing range. And I don't think anyone has really made a claim yet that Camarasaurus, the most common sauropod in the Morrison, so we have a lot of them, was grazing on the ground.
It's fascinating. That is so much good information about sauropods, and I can't wait to hear what you end up publishing from it. I'm sure we are all looking forward to that. I just wanted to ask a couple of more questions quickly before we wrap up. So the first question I have for you is Jack Perkins at Melbourne Museum was telling me, and I know, guys, I say the R in Melbourne. It sounds worse if I don't. Jack Perkins mentioned that you guys are working on something and that you didn't mind giving us a little sneak peek. Is this also to do with dinosaurs?
This does also have to do with dinosaurs, yeah. So what Jack is referring to is last year at SVP, I gave a presentation on a project that actually started with some coding classes I took at BYU. So hypercarnivorous megatheropods, theropods over 1,000 kilograms in weight. We have, in this case, roughly 5 clades that contain members who would be considered hypercarnivorous megatheropods. These are some of the most charismatic theropods out there. People know them. People sometimes love them. Other times they don't love them. They include, in this case, tyrannosauroids, which includes our famous T-Rex, right? One of the most classic examples. It also includes megaraptorans, or at least megaraptorans, and we treated for this project megaraptorans as coelurosaurs, but separate from tyrannosauroids. And we have a few megaraptorans that are definitely over 1,000 kilograms, and they are kind of a medium to large body predator in the environments they live in. Then we also have now ceratosaurians, right? Ceratosaurians, such as especially abelisaurs, right? Then you have megalosauroids, which includes Spinosaurus as well as Megalosaurus. And finally, last but never least, Allosauroids, which includes our Allosaurus, our Metriacanthosaurs, our Carcharodontosaurs, our Neovenators, such as Neovenator. So we have these 5 clades, and I initially just asked the question, okay, where in time and space do we see these clades coexisting with each other, right? Can we start to tell a story of who's coexisting with who, when, and what's going on? And as we started to plot these things out, where we gave each of the species initially a temporal value and a spatial value, right? So a single landmass, we started to see some interesting trends in terms of where things were popping up, who was popping up with who, and what places were they popping up. And so a lot of the earlier work, when it was focused on this temporal spatial overlap, found there seemed to be a trend of earlier temporal spatial overlap in the kind of northern hemisphere and Europe, which we treated as a Mesozoic ecotone, or place where you have faunal mixing from multiple communities, especially because Europe, we see classic fauna from the north and we see fauna from the south, especially in the late Cretaceous, where you get titanosaurs and abelisaurs mixing with hadrosaurs and potential new ceratopsians. Europe seems to be this faunal mixing pot. So that's why we said, well, we're going to treat Europe as different from the rest of the northern hemisphere, or in this case, Asia America. And then this trend was followed by latter southern temporal spatial overlap. As we started digging into the literature more, we started to see some trends regarding potential the size classes as defined by Holtz's 2021 paper between these animals, coupled with, along with that, all right, who was overlapping with who and who doesn't overlap with who. We have yet to find, as far as I know, a confirmed abelisaur or a valid abelisaur genus with a confirmed valid tyrannosaur genus. So abelisaurs and tyrannosaurs don't seem to be mixing. Megaraptorans and tyrannosaurs also, I believe, they live at certain times near each other, but we haven't found them, to my knowledge, confirmed in the same environment yet. So we had some interesting questions, and we were able to use some of the literature to try to help explain some of the trends we saw in the data. Now the project has morphed a little bit, so we're more looking at kind of the relationships regarding those size classes and less temporal spatial overlap. But we're still trying to get a story kind of regarding all right, in terms of who lives with who, what is going on as these 5 different clades evolve and diversify? Because there's a lot of evidence.
Fascinating.
One specific example is there seems to be this evidence that with regard to potential temporal spatial overlap, near the end of the Cretaceous, we see abelisaurs and we see megaraptorans both in South America. However, what the literature discusses seems to start to happen is there starts to be this split where you have abelisaurs in the north in Brazil, and then in Patagonia and to the south you have megaraptorans, but you don't have them in each other's environment. So it seems they almost kind of split the continent a little bit in half and say, okay, you stay on your side and I stay on mine. That way at least the hypercarnivorous predatory ones aren't competing with each other. But of course, the word is still out on if that is exactly happening. It's just there have been several papers discussing, well, maybe there seems to be this kind of difference in the fauna between north and south.
Well, they've split the continent evenly between those who've skipped leg day and those who've skipped arm day, which is, of course, the best way to divide yourself up. I have one more question for you before we wrap up. You can choose your own adventure here. So either I would like to hear you tell me about the worst example of either a sauropod or an allosaur that you've seen in popular media, so you can have a little rant if you'd like, or if you'd like to tell us about some media you recommend, if there's a particularly good example of how these animals are discussed and displayed.
I'll go with the positive versus, in this case, just disparaging one type of media. I think in terms of what really works, it's still revolutionary for the times. A lot of the early 2000s work with the Walking With series is fantastic for any type of prehistoric animal, because from some of the classic lines that stick with you to the CGI, to the stories that were told, we got realistic animals that fought, that died, that tried to breed, that tried to survive, right? The predator did not always win. We can see that with Big Al, who literally, MOR 693 in that series kept getting injuries at different points throughout its life. I believe the total now is up to 20 pathologies on one single skeleton of an Allosaur. So it's really interesting, and they treated it that way, right? They put it's called Big Al represents a frozen moment in the fast and furious life of a carnivorous dinosaur, as I remember the line correctly. And so these documentaries were fantastic. One that has especially stuck with me, and it's difficult because, so you mentioned you're from Tennessee, and this documentary relates to both of us, but it also doesn't really touch on either of our states' Mesozoic history, is When Dinosaurs Roamed America. This was narrated by John Goodman, who people might recognize as the voice of Sully from Monsters, Inc. And so to just hear Sully very sometimes grimly and just kind of very intense give lines such as, "There's one more surprise in store, Mom," or, "For the mail, there's always tomorrow." It was a fantastic documentary that also told some amazing stories, treated these animals, once again, as, almost as if we went out and filmed them on the plains of Africa or, the Great Plains of North America today, right? It didn't try to tell, gruesome, terrifying stories. You had underdogs, you had evolutionary underdogs who would grow up. We had other animals who, hit their prime and then had their time and were done. And so these were some really great documentaries. Otherwise, it's specific to the Maastrichtian, but Prehistoric Planet does a really good job with a lot of the science it discusses, and the animals, how they act and behave, and some of the science that went into the program, and some of the scientists who get to discuss, what went into the program there.
Yeah, I think that's you've made a really good point as well, because I think that when we look to media like Jurassic Park to portray dinosaurs, right, they are fiction stories that are trying to convey other things. It's not necessarily about treating these animals as animals. They're allegorical, they are mysterious, they're meant to be, bad guys to some extent. So it's interesting when we do get docuseries that treat them as living animals. And it's, I think, important as paleontologists to keep that animal aspect in mind and treat them as things that would have lived and done all of these things, eating, procreating, much like animals today. So that, I would agree. I think that those are all fantastic pieces of media, and I feel very relieved to hear that the allosaurs in those were depicted well, so I can now continue to rely on those as my source of information beyond yourself. I do want to thank you for a terrific interview and so much amazing information about sauropods, allosaurs, and everything in between. Where can our listeners find you on social media?
On Twitter, I think it's at Colin Boisvert 1, and I believe on Instagram it's at Colin Boisvert 54. Type my name, you should see my face. It definitely looks like me. In fact, I think my Insta page, if I remember correctly, is me, funny enough, holding a cast of an Allosaurus stromatinae skull. So people will say, oh yeah, it's that guy.
Yes. So do give Colin a look, give him a follow, and keep up with his work. It sounds like there's plenty of exciting stuff in the pipeline for our listeners to turn to.
Alyssa, that was such a great chat with Colin. He really talked a lot about that thing we discussed of how many big herbivores you can have living in one location, which is also one of the puzzles in that English theropod discovery. I learned so much from that chat. I think, he could talk all day or for weeks without a break by the sounds of things, and I could listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was so patient with my needing to record while I was in the US on my museum trip and bopping around New York. He really tolerated the background noise, which I hope our listeners will as well. Yeah, it was just a fascinating chat, and I'm so glad that he came on the show. I hope you guys will continue to follow him on his adventures in paleo.
Let's have a chat now about naming our fantastic mascots for the podcast. These were designed, just to remind people, these were designed by Zev Landis, who is a fantastic artist, paleo artist, and also he just creates all sorts of other art. We'll put Zev's details in the show notes so you can go and check him out. And we had so many good responses to this. I was nervous as to if anyone would even respond, but so many people did. We put this up as stories on our individual stories on Instagram and on the Fossils and Fiction Instagram account, and also on Blue Sky, and the responses just poured in from all over the place. So Paleo Astrid on Instagram, which is Astrid O'Connor, who you've mentioned already today, former guest on the show, gave us a whole bunch of suggestions. Astrid suggested Chomper for the Australovenator and Dave for Estrangia, the trilobite. And also, direct to Alyssa, Astrid gave you another suggestion.
And it was Tang and Tor. So Estrangia, taking the Tang from there, and Tor from the end of Australovenator.
I like that one. Jimmy Waldron, another past guest on the show from Dinosaurs Will Always Be Awesome, also an excellent dinosaur podcast and educator out there, suggests Scratch for the Australovenator and Skitters for the trilobite.
So cute. And then we also had a suggestion from, and I'm so sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, we've been mutuals forever on different social media. Saria Zoisilis suggested Scuttle and Claw, which is very my naming convention for my stuffed toys.
There's so many good names here. The Dino Nerds said Sizzle and Amy, which I love as well. Jack Perkins, who we've already mentioned. Do you want to take this one?
He suggested Meg and Tilly, which is adorable as well.
My wife is named Meg, so I don't know if I can go with that one. Just.
Yeah, are you comparing her to the bug or the giant dinosaur?
Yeah.
Tread carefully.
Not too sure. Josh, or aka Blue Morpho 86 on Instagram, suggested Izzy and Scraps.
Adele Pentland also suggested Esteban and Megara, which so fancy, so Spanish, and then so very Hercules, the animated series. Love that. We also got a suggestion on Instagram that I can't find anymore because it was a reply to the story, and I don't know what happened to it. I'm sorry, but Jack Jones also made a suggestion. Jack, if you're listening, please message me your suggestion.
Natalia Jagielska, an excellent paleontologist from, I think, currently working in the UK.
Such a fangirl of her work. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I have her sticker on my laptop.
Incredible. She does some incredible work. Natalia suggests Bobo and Bibi, which is a nice, cute pair. I like that one. Also over on Blue Sky, someone going by the name of Goosebuster suggested Dino and Craig. And I just love the notion.
Craig is so, one of my supervisors is named Craig as well, which is so funny.
And we have to be careful that people don't think that we're naming it after them. But also,
Yeah.
we didn't suggest these names. We didn't come up with this list ourselves.
No.
Edge, who is a science YouTuber, suggested Todd and Ruffles as well, which is a really good one. And there was one more suggestion from Blue Sky, which was Kamira, who suggested Barry and Bob. So just nice, simple Barry and Bob. So how are we going to do this, Alyssa? How are we going to decide?
I'm struggling so much because I think they're all so fantastic, and I don't think I can pick just one. I think I could pick 3, and that could be, I could pick that many.
Okay, so what if we pick 3 between us?
Yes.
3 pairs, and we'll put those up on Instagram for a final poll on the Fossils and Fiction Instagram account.
I think that's such a good idea. And then it's out of our hands yet again, and the fabulous people who made these suggestions can help us one last time.
So we'll poll it on Instagram, and we will also poll it on the show's Spotify page. I think that's probably a good place. So if you want to engage with us on Spotify, you can do it there or on Instagram. We will poll the 3 suggested pairs. So we need to go with, okay, I'm going to pick out Dave and Craig. And I think Dave for the trilobite. So this comes from one of Astrid's suggestions. And then Craig for the Australovenator.
Thank you, Goosebuster. And I think that's so perfect. Like, Dave, we had a colleague named Dave, and I don't want to say that he gives trilobite energy, but trilobites give Dave energy. Absolutely.
That's one way to look at it.
I promise this is not just a show of me negging my acquaintances. I love Scratch and Skitters. That's so cute.
Scratch and Skitters from Jimmy Waldron, yep.
So cute. And then,
Oh.
I don't know, like, my third pick would be Scuttle and Claw, but I have room in my heart for other suggestions if you really want to fight. Because, like, Tang and Tor also really, I like that as well. What do you think?
Tang and Tor is really good too. I think as a pair. So this is going to be Astrid. Astrid's come up with the goods here. We know how creative Astrid is, but Astrid's got 3 names in the 6. So, all right, Tang and Tor from Astrid. We're gonna put these, and that's gonna be good because then Astrid's vote won't swing it too much because who knows which one they're gonna go for.
Yeah. I just think, those are such good choices, and I'm so appreciative to everyone who wrote in. Thank you all so much.
Okay, Scratch and Skitters, Craig and Dave, and Tang and Tor will go up on our Instagram and Spotify pages for a poll. We will compile the votes before our next episode and make a decision. And I think the people who suggested these winners will make sure we get some stickers featuring the Australovenator and the Trilobite Estrangia out to you. We'll make sure we get those in the mail if your names are the suggested ones, the suggested winners. So I so look forward to naming these cute little critters.
Yes, absolutely. That and merch, the 2 best things in the world. And I might even, so my problem is buying a lot of stuffed animals, and I might even use some of the ones we didn't use for the show to name these other fabulous creatures behind me.
Yeah, I think we're going to need somebody at some point to make them into stuffed animals. Travis dropping in post-recording with an announcement to say that the next segment gets a little graphic. We talk about fighting prehistoric creatures and the various things they could do to a human. If you have sensitive ears listening into this episode, it might be best to skip ahead. I've been listening to PBS's Eons, and in particular their new podcast series, which asks how would you survive in a past prehistoric era? And so they have a different episode focusing on various eras. So the Carboniferous is one I was listening to this morning, and there's the Devonian and the Cambrian explosion. So all of these different eras, and I suddenly thought, what it sounds like to me when they're doing the interviews. So they have the main host, Callie, and then they take somebody else from the PBS Eons team, and they discuss how to survive the particular era. It's a really, really cool podcast, definitely worth checking out. But it sounded to me, I just keep picturing it as like, you know, like in a reality TV show like Big Brother or something, they speak to the guests before they go into the house, and it's like, what your strategy going to be? How are you going to win this thing? How are you going to survive? And it sounds to me like these chats that they have on the podcast is like that. Like, how are you going to go in and survive? And then it's missing the next step, right? Even though it's so well researched and so interesting, is like, I would love to see a paleo doc done like this, where these interviews on PBS Eons are like the introduction to before they release somebody into the Carboniferous.
It sounds like, so Ben Francis Shelley is a megalodon researcher here in Victoria, and he recently had an exhibit about prehistoric Bayside, which was a period of time when the Beaumaris Formation had megalodons and giant whales and all these like things that were out there that could totally kill you. And he filmed this short movie of himself fending off like megs and things like it. It sounds, I promise you, it's super cool, and I would watch a full-length version of that any day. It was like, absolutely. And we all think of, like, I can't say we all think about it, but we think about it. Paleontologists think about it.
How would you actually survive in this era? So for our version of this, the fossils and fiction version of PBS's Eon Surviving Deep Time is going to be, which prehistoric animal would you fight? We've got 3 categories. The first one, the one that I'm going to put to you, is prehistoric mammals. So you have 4 potential contenders. You have to choose which of these you would have the best opportunity of fighting against. A Megatherium, which is a giant ground sloth from South America. It is an elephant-sized animal with massive claws, incredibly strong. It's like imagine wrestling a living, breathing tree with murder mittens. So it's
Yeah,
not, this is not the sort of slow moving sloth that we think of. This is a dangerous beast.
and dense bones. If you see these guys at any of your local museums, you will notice that their bones are dense. And those murder mittens, he's not kidding. The claws are ginormous.
That's number one, the Megatherium. Number two is a Smilodon, your classic
Ooh.
saber-toothed cat. This is like the size of a large lion with those massive canine teeth. It's an ambush predator.
One of the strongest bite forces in the animal kingdom,
Yeah.
is my understanding.
So teeth the size of steak knives is the thing that you're contending with mostly here.
Oh.
Now, this might seem like a gimme, but I don't think it's as easy as you would think. And the next one I've come up with is Diprotodon, the largest marsupial ever. We've had an episode or a couple of episodes where Diprotodon has been mentioned. This is a car-sized wombat, probably weighs 2 tons, massive body weight with thick hide and thick fur, not to mention pretty gnarly front teeth. I think even though this is a herbivore, it could take a decent bite out of you in a fight. If you think you can take down a living tank, this is the one to pick. And finally, a direwolf. This is a larger than a modern wolf. I had the pleasure of going to the La Brea tar pits where they have a huge collection of direwolf skulls earlier this year, and to see them just laid out there, these are huge wolves. They pack hunt. They have extremely powerful bite. Okay, what do you think out of those 4? Megatherium, Smilodon, Diprotodon, or direwolf?
Well, it's so tough. It's so tough because, like, it depends on what your attack strategy is, I think, right? Like, are you whittling down the boss's health bar, Elden Ring style, or are you waiting to interrupt the attack pattern of the world's most dangerous kitty? I saw the beautifully preserved, really intact Smilodon skeleton at the Smithsonian on my visit, and my gosh, like, I think the thing that impressed me more than its ability to completely nosh my brain would be how small it was compared to how absolutely murderous this thing would have been. But I know in my heart of hearts I couldn't fight a kitty. I could never fight a kitty cat. I would give up. I would let it eat my face.
Okay, so we're going to rule out the Smilodon.
I can't, yeah. And then I've been to a wolf sanctuary before. It's just thinking, like, the thing that I think all of us are thinking, which, like, coyotes aren't that big. Wolves can't be. They are that big. They are. That thing would destroy my face. So out of the remaining 2, I would have to say...
So we've got the ground sloth, the Megatherium, or Diprotodon, sometimes called a giant wombat. What would you go with? Now, one of the other reasons I had to put Diprotodon in here is I came across this extraordinary fact around the way they use this is actual wombats now, not Diprotodon, as far as we know. The way they use their girthy rear to block the entrance to their burrows and potentially squash any predators who try and come into the burrow against the roof of the burrow using their rear end.
Death by butt. Horrible. And, like, no, this is true. This is all very true. There's actually warning signs in areas with wombats to look out for them in your car because they will face your car with their butt like they would a predator.
Mm-hmm.
And your car is probably not going to do great after that encounter. It will total your vehicle. It's madness. I think out of those 2, at least the Diprotodon's neck is not going to have the same reach that the Megatherium's claws are going to have. Like, that swing radius, if you could get behind it on the neck, and I'm prefacing this by saying I would die no matter what. Like, I look at these arms. These are not, like, slaying mitts. I'm a delicate creature. But if I had to, I would pick the Diprotodon. I'm sorry, Australia. This is why I can't be citizen.
So Alyssa's going to fight a Diprotodon. If there's anyone out there who would love to do some fan art of that, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would pin it on my fridge. But I think it is now your turn to weigh in on a fight. Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
In this imaginary boxing ring, in one corner you have everyone's favorite, the Velociraptor. A turkey-sized, much smaller than you would think based on the Jurassic Park movie, sharp, sickle-clawed, pack-hunting, intelligent murder chicken whose Potential tagline, if he was on a poster, would be technically smaller than you, but way more motivated.
I still think, even though a velociraptor is smaller than the one in Jurassic Park, I still think of that Alan Grant line about using the claws to gut you, and then you are alive when they start eating you.
Yeah, and I mean,
And I just think
turkey
that
size.
is so horrifying.
I'm like, turkey size sounds reasonable at first, but like I challenge you to look up an American male turkey and ask whether you would even fight that creature.
I mean, if you've ever had a goose chase you while you're, at a park or something, which I have, that would not be fun.
In the other corner, taking up the significantly larger foot square space, you have everyone's king of lizards, Tyrannosaurus rex, a bus-sized predator who has a massive bone-crunching bite and incredible sensory skills. The movie had it all wrong. If you hold still, he's absolutely still going to bite you.
I think we can rule out T-Rex straight away. I mean, ain't nobody taking on a T-Rex. Unless the only real chance here, but it's not exactly a fight, is just to run. And maybe you could outrun it.
Yeah, outrun it or hope you pass by something that's more delectable on the way out.
That's another option.
You don't have to be fast.
Or find a human-sized cave to hide in.
Yes,
Which the Jurassic Park movies, a Jurassic Park book and movie also tried, right? In The Lost World, they hide in behind the waterfall. Yeah. And it was in the book in Jurassic Park, they hide in behind the waterfall, and the T-Rex still gets them, so
much for hiding in our pleasant little mammal burrows. Okay, next up is one of my favorites, the Ankylosaur. It is a tank-sized dinosaur with a teeny tiny little brain and a massive thwacker, a club tail, and an armored body. These animals were like living medieval weapons with built-in tank armor.
I feel like you get hit by this tail club and you just get pulverized. Your body evaporates.
I think somebody put it best in our lab chat, saying that I think it hits with like the force of 100 razor scooters. No more shins, something like that.
Yeah, that's frightening.
And then last but certainly not least, we have everyone's favorite contentious large dinosaur, our friend the Spinosaurus. Surprisingly larger than T-Rex, with a massive structure on its back, sail-like structure we think at present. I'm so hesitant to say anything about their anatomy. The Spinosaurus fans, do not at me. But with semi-aquatic hunting skills. So we think this animal actually spent some of its life in water, which makes it scarier to go swimming. It's part dinosaur, it's part crocodile, and 100% nightmare fuel.
Yeah, wow. I feel like these are worse options than you had.
Absolutely.
I think T-Rex is out. There's no way I see a human escaping or successfully fighting a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You just cannot. They were specialized for eating stuff.
Yeah, stuff much more dangerous than us.
Yeah. Spinosaurus the same. Whether in or out of the water, I do not fancy my chances against the Spinosaurus. I think, I just can't see that. I just can't see that happening. Assuming we're talking about like a face-to-face, body-to-body fight here.
Pistols at dawn.
Yeah, like if I could push a giant boulder onto the Spinosaurus while it was swimming in the river, then, okay. But if
the land before time method, yes.
Yeah, if that's not what's happening, then I think Spinosaurus is out too. So, which leaves me with Velociraptor or Ankylosaurus. Now, I'm tempted just for the size factor to say Velociraptor.
Yeah.
But, that thing is going to just rip me apart. Like, there's a lot of meat on me, and I think a Velociraptor would see that as quite a snackable thing. So I think I'm just, it's gonna rip my ankles open, and I'm not going to be able to move, and that's the end. So I'm gonna have to go with Ankylosaurus. Now, here's how this will work. I see myself fashioning a stick into a sharp point, and although Ankylosaurus had incredible armor and osteoderms all over its body, I reckon I can get that point into a gap somewhere.
Like slaying a very bloated and slow-moving land-bound Tolkien-esque dragon.
Yeah, I feel like the only thing about an Ankylosaurus that's fast is probably the swing of the tail club. So all I got to do is avoid that. If I get hit by that tail club, as I say, I think it's just like red mist. evaporating. Sorry,
Instant
this is really
fatality.
gross. We're gonna have to put a language warning on this episode.
And again, if anybody wants to make fan art of Travis dragon style murdering this ankylosaur, I can only encourage that behavior.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, so I don't know if we're at the sort of size where we have fans who'll make some fan art of us. But if someone wants to make fan art of me fighting an ankylosaurus, or Alyssa fighting a diprotodon, then I'd love to. Oh, actually, we've kind of gone the same choice there, actually, haven't we?
We both picked tanks, which I
Yeah.
think says something about our usual like video game style approach.
Okay, the last one we're gonna work through this one together. This is your assorted others. We have
Features.
first up Megalodon, which is the whale-sized shark, absolutely huge, often compared to, I think, mostly inaccurately, except perhaps in the terms of niche partitioning, to a great white shark. Enormous skills, and assuming here that you're in the ocean, because what's that old joke about a shark can swim faster than me, but I can outrun a shark, so in a triathlon it'd come down to the cycling event. We're not talking about that, but
yeah, if you're in the water, this thing's
assume
gone.
you're in the water here with a megalodons.
Yeah, so after that we have, this is one of my favorites, Sarcosuchus, a super croc. He was longer than a city bus with massive jaws and an armored body. I want to say this one is an Aussie native, is that right?
I don't think Sarcosuchus was, but there's plenty of other crocodiles of large size from Australia.
I just wanted to say crikey, but that's okay. This is
You can say that when it's coming at you, like, no worries.
I think all I would manage to say is and then I would just be dead. Yeah, modern crocodiles, excellent animals, have not had to evolve because they're already nature's perfect murder log. And this is just a larger murder log, a murder redwood, if you will.
Yeah, and so here again, I think you get a choice between, you're in the riverbank area. You may not be in the water, but you're in the area that we assume.
It's like an ambush predator style thing, right? Again, for people, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sarcosuchus is definitely going to be difficult to fight. So, okay, Mosasaurus, massive marine reptile, very powerful swimmer, huge crushing bite. This is like a great white shark mixed with a sea dragon.
These things are just terrifyingly large. You might think from the Jurassic World franchise you have an idea of how really terrifying it would be to be around them, but I think standing next to the models in museums gives you a much frighteninger experience of this animal. They are huge, 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 with great big teeth.
You would not want to be in the water with a mosasaur, but that's what we're asking.
And if you were on land, you would also still not be safe depending on the time period you're in. Our good friend, Quetzalcoatlus. The Quetzalcoatlus is named for one of the Mayan winged serpent gods, and the brutality of the god is definitely reflected in this animal. It was a giraffe-sized flying reptile with a massive wingspan and a sharp beak. And again, birds might not at first feel frightening, but I think pelicans are freaky deaky, and this animal could just absolutely have snapped you up in its beak, and that would have been the end of you.
It makes me think of those pelicans when you see them. Like just recently, I saw a pelican eating a dove, I think, or a seagull. So it just had a full. And there's also these videos going around of pelicans trying to pick up capybaras.
Yes, that great meme of like, put the baby in the pelican's mouth.
Yeah. So we're going to say the pterosaur that could scoop you up like a snack.
Yes.
I have a true weight advantage compared to you on that one, I think, which is great.
To be honest, like, I'm thinking he would be the choice either way, because, like, out of all of these, he would have, like, the lightest bones, which would make him easier to throw a big rock at, I think.
Okay, so we're gonna go and fight the Quetzalcoatlus.
I think that's my go, because Ben Francis Shelley has made me too afraid of the megalodon.
I have enough problems with deep water without thinking about an actual megalodon or mosasaurus for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. Unless Sarcosuchus is subject to this, what's that? The apocryphal story about running diagonally to try and get away from a.
Oh yeah, serpentining.
Crocodile.
Yeah.
Then, but again, if you've actually got to face up to it, then Quetzalcoatlus is probably the one to go with. I think it's going to result with, speared through the belly by the beak, but there we go.
Oh yeah,
It's
or
probably
just
the best option.
now you're airborne, now you're not, and then you're a delicious. See, this is what I like about the Cambrian. Most of the things during this period probably couldn't have killed me, and some of them look delicious. I think more about eating them than being murdered by them.
I absolutely came really close to like putting a trilobite here or a Nominocaris or those kinds of early weirdos.
To be honest, it would probably be either the giant eurypterids, which I did a thread about on Blue Sky recently, which could get up to, we think, 8 feet in length, or it would be the giant lobopods. Gilled lobopods, omnidens, would have been about 5 feet in the Cambrian with one of those radial mouths. He keeps me up at night, but most other things during that time period, the size comparison would be to like cats, house cats.
Yeah. Trilobites, I feel like, would be pretty easy. You just need a reasonably sharp rock and...
Or a very big shoe. They are a stompable animal, I think. Like a crab. Anyway.
Well, that's very interesting. So we are going to go out there and you are going to fight a Diprotodon. I am going to fight an Ankylosaurus. And then together we're going to go after a Quetzalcoatlus.
Delicious giant turkey of the sky.
Turkey of the sky. Now I want some fan art of a Quetzalcoatlus done up like a turkey ready to go into the baster, into the roaster.
Send us your recipes.
I think that's a good point to end this, almost to end this episode on, that we should go away and come up with your favorite Christmas recipes featuring extinct animals.
Absolutely, yes. See how you could incorporate those delicious little hadrosaurs in your next family meal.
Yeah, we'll come back in January and maybe come up with some suggestions. I just want to note that our friends at the Common Descent podcast have been named as one of the top 10 natural science podcasts by Podbean. Overall, they're just fantastic. So I really hope people get out and listen to them if you haven't. I'm sure anyone who listens to this podcast also listens to Common Descent, but they are fantastic guys. So if you've not hung out with David and Will, fully recommend it as well.
And they've just done an episode with Adele. So if you're a fan of her interview on this podcast, check her out there.
Yeah, Adele's been on this podcast a couple of times. She's so great. She's a lot of fun. I'm sure. Have you ever actually hung out with Adele?
I have, and I can guarantee you that she is absolutely as fabulous and fun in person as she is on camera. It's absolutely a delight to have a chat with her and to just hang out. She's so fascinating. I can pick her brain all day. She knows so much stuff. Not just about dinosaurs, but farming and all sorts of things.
Yeah, she's certainly a lot of fun. So shout out to Adele, shout out to Common Descent, to Astrid and Edge and
to Colin
Natalia
and Jack
and everyone else who gave us suggestions for names. We're going to make sure those are up on the polls. Thank you so much for listening in so far to this rebooted Fossils and Fiction. And we're going to have episodes fortnightly throughout 2025. See you then.
And have a great holiday season and a happy new year. We look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Fossils and Fiction. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to rate, review, and follow us on your favorite podcast platform.
And don't forget to connect with us on social media. Share your fossil-inspired stories, art, or questions. We'd love to feature you in an upcoming episode. Until next time, keep exploring the culture and science of paleontology.